Do you work with women that are having trouble with leaking or incontinence during exercise? Well, I've got two questions that I want you to ask them. One, is it happening at the very beginning, like the first lift or the first couple jumps, and then it improves during the session, so they only notice maybe a little bit in the beginning? Or is it happening at the end once they get fatigued, or is it happening when they are maxing out and lifting as much as possible? So these are two different situations that I like to approach in a different way. So I want to give you just a couple little tips to think about and make sure you ask these questions. So for those women that notice that they leak right at the beginning, and it's almost like, oh, their body's got to get used to it. But then once they fatigue out a bit toward the end, then they feel like, okay, my pelvic floor is working and things are going well and I'm not leaking quite as much. So if this happens, then you're really going to want to look at the warm up. So they're probably sitting where their pelvic floor is a little bit more in a distended state. Their pelvis is probably a little bit more, their inlet's probably a little more externally rotated, and they're probably just kind of sitting more in like a distended hypotonic type of needing to ramp up pelvic floor state. And so for this, I would include lots of dynamic warm up. So one thing I really like to do is on the way to the gym, you can have them work on pelvic floor contractions, but have them really focus on the front of the pelvic floor. So when you think about those pelvic floor muscles, you can think gather in the back. So go ahead and do that for me now, thinking about tucking your bottom and stopping gas, or you can think gather from the front. And this is gonna be more of those anterior pelvic floor muscles, also gonna really help with sexual satisfaction. So when they're on the way to the gym, what I want you to think about is having them gather these front pelvic floor muscles. So they're gonna almost think, I kind of want to zipper from the front, but then also zipper up. So you're gonna think about this almost like a little connection coming down from the front of the pelvic floor and coming up into those lower abs. So I'll even have people place their fingers right on their pubic bone and then kind of dip right above their pubic bone, really working on getting those front pelvic floor muscles engaged with their lower abs. Now, everything is gonna come in for a big contraction, but this is gonna be how they initiate that contraction and how they get that pelvic floor going. Now, once we have that pelvic floor going and they're at the gym, they're ready to do their work, or they're at the clinic, then I want you to think about how we can make this dynamic to fit the exercise that they're doing. Okay, so if they're doing hard exercise, then we're gonna need to bring in a more challenging warm-up. I like to go about that warm-up from two angles. One, quick force, preparing for that load, preparing for that intra-abdominal pressure, preparing for maybe the load of their feet hitting the ground. So I like to come at it from that angle. Then I want to come at it from the inside. So then we're going to work intra-abdominal pressure from the inside out. You can put them in a rather intense ab position, maybe blow up a balloon or a breathing trainer if they have one, to really encourage that, dealing with that intra-abdominal pressure from the inside out. Now, if you have somebody who says, whew, I can do, like 6 double unders, but when I start pushing into like, the 10 to 20 range or the 1 minute range, then that's when I start notice leaking. Or if I'm gonna have a max out deadlifting day or squat day, that's when I notice leaking. And this when I'm gonna take a step back and I'm gonna ask them, all right, do you ever do any pelvic floor contractions? And this is especially important if they have seen a pelvic health professional and they have ruled out pelvic floor tension and they have maybe normal pelvic floor strength. But what you're looking at is, what the heck do the rest of the muscles in their body look like? And have they spent a lot of time working on strength and hypertrophy, and they've got these great muscles, but did they ever do anything for their pelvic floor? Did they think about their pelvic floor when they were planning their workout program? And so it might be that the rest of their system, especially when we look at lats, because those lats are really wrapping and compressive, and when we think about how much the lats are involved in, especially when we're doing something like a deadlift, it can put tremendous amounts of pressure down. We think about those upper abs and having to control this, tremendous amounts of pressure. So if the pelvic floor isn't strong enough to handle that pressure, then that's when we might notice some leaking or some escaping of pressure out through the pelvic floor. And this can also be applied to prolapse. So we have to have the strength of the pelvic floor match the strength of the rest of their body. Okay, so we might actually need to prescribe kegels. We might need to prescribe pelvic floor contractions at this point. So for this, I might even have them do weighted pelvic floor contractions, weighted kegels with the little kegel weights to really help them build their pelvic floor strength to match the strength of their glutes, of their lats. Some people just, it happens naturally, right? The pelvic floor is just along for the ride. So at every rep of their squat, every rep of their deadlift, every rep of, split stance stuff, they are getting pelvic floor strength. And then other people, not so much. And I kind of like to think about this comparison with the shoulder as well, because I've seen lots of people with shoulder issues where they really overuse their rotator cuff, they overuse their delt, but they don't get a whole lot of mid and lower trap involvement when they're naturally lifting, when they're doing their row or whatever their lifting thing is. And for that person, I'm going to want to say, hey, we need to really work on isolating those middle and lower traps because we've got to get a lot more scapula strength and involvement in this movement. Same thing for getting that serratus involved. So are we working more the middle or are we just going from kind of the outside? So we all have those tendencies throughout our body where we have a tendency to go for one muscle group maybe over another. So just because you're doing an exercise doesn't mean that you're doing it exactly the same way or using the same muscle groups as, say, somebody else doing the exercise. And this is particularly true when it comes to the pelvic floor and recruitment of the pelvic floor. So if you're somebody who maybe naturally doesn't recruit the pelvic floor when you do the stuff, or maybe you've had a history of tightness, and then it all kind of compounds. And so that might be when I would think, okay, we might actually need a stronger pelvic floor to match the strength of the rest of the body. All right, so just a couple fun things to ask questions, get involved, and help these women be able to get stronger and lift heavier.